Language is crucial to understanding societies. It's crucial to recognising the ecological, social, political and economic conditions in which we live. We use language to frame problems, formulate solutions, to negotiate and communicate political and economic pitfalls. Language is interaction that can accelerate action. But language is also performance, and performances can be used to distract from inaction, to avoid action, or postpone action, as much as to accelerate it. And language is what we focus on in this second series of our Language and Power podcast. Hi Tom, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Michael. How's yourself?
Yeah, very well. And we are today talking about apologies. So for people who've been looking at the news, there was a famous apology, set of apologies, things that look like apologies, involving Will Smith, the actor, and Chris Rock, the comedian, at the Oscar ceremony this year. So very famous incident now of violence, a joke that was perhaps misdirected, and violent response from Will Smith. And what we're going to talk about are the subsequent apologies, particularly by Will Smith on this. And I guess I'm sort of presuming that we count them as apologies, but that's the issue, isn't it, Tom?
It is exactly what makes an apology, and it's something that, what any sort of speech act, we've talked of speech acts before.
Yeah.
What constitutes a particular speech act, but particularly an apology is a particularly contentious one. And then if you look this up on the internet, you'll see lots of talk about, was this a proper apology? So I think, you don't get people on the internet often talking about promise. Well, actually, with Brexit, you did get people talking about promises a lot. So speech acts are things that people are genuinely interested in and can cause quite a lot of furore.
Yeah. I don't think I've spoken about speech acts so much as we have on this podcast, actually. it's a bit, but it's true. A very, very, interesting and useful way of thinking about the way that people communicate with each other. So speech acts. So perhaps people talk about what we would call speech acts. They talk about whether a promise was genuine or whether an apology was genuine, and that kind of everyday debate we would see in terms of speech act theory, or also pragmatics and so on. So before we start, what does speech acts theory say about apologies?
Okay, yeah. So we've talked in the past about felicity conditions, and that what makes an act work as a speech act. And maybe just a tiny bit of history about speech act theory. When people used to study language, they thought it was all about the ideas in language, about expressing ideas about the world. And then people began to say, well, actually, there's action. You've got some speech, some actions called performative verbs, where it's not about transmitting thought, it's about doing things like, I name this ship the good ship Lollipop, where you're actually doing something, but by doing that in language, you have done it. It's the language that does it. It's not subsidiary or ancillary to other things. Her speech act then grew out of that to say, well, actually, all language is doing that. All language is trying to do stuff. It's behavior, that they did focus on particular things. And they try, it comes from a very philosophical tradition, wasn't it? And they tried to say, to make this a promise rather than any other speech act or an apology or the naming of a ship, I can't just go in and say, for example, I can't walk into an examination room and say, I hereby pass this exam. It doesn't work. There are certain conditions necessary for things to be done. And in terms of apologies, it starts off quite simply, but we'll see as we're talking, it's much more complicated. That in the pragmatics literature, the speech act literature, basically to make an apology, you need to name the offence and name it as an offence. You need to accept responsibility for the offence. You need to use the right wording to make an apology, to make, there's a specific form needed. But also one of the felicity conditions, and this is the hard one because this is the one that you can't really do in language itself, is you have to be sincere. You have to genuinely mean the apology. And that's where we'll see that when people start talking about apologies and stuff, they're looking at the wording and they're questioning, have all these different things been done, and many other things. It gets much more complicated, but also there's a big debate about, is it sincere? And we'll see that comes up a lot in this Will Smith and Me Too and other things as well.
Yeah. And there's some, even there with the speech act, that kind of pragmatics approach, it's really interesting in terms of some of the apologies that you sometimes hear put forward. in all sorts of areas of life, which are then say, well, you're not apologizing for the thing that I want you to apologize. So a very typical kind of formula in politics is something like, I apologize if anyone was offended by my remarks, rather than apologizing for the remarks themselves.
Yeah.
And now, that's, slightly controversial in the discourse areas of discourse analysis in saying, well, I- I- if offence can be caused, then if you name the offence as being the thing that you're apologizing for, there's a sort of grey area there. But yeah, maybe we'll come into that
I think
a
we'll
little
come
bit
back to
later.
it because I find that really fascinating. And I
Yeah,
have a sympathy actually with politicians of all shades, which isn't
yeah,
like me
yeah.
on this one. That people are, I think it's actually all right to say, I'm really sorry if I caused offence, but actually I didn't do anything wrong as far as I'm concerned. But it gets a really bad press.
It
And
does,
we'll
doesn't it?
maybe talk
Yeah.
about that
Yeah.
later.
Okay.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. Well, what should we? So, for people who didn't know, you can look it up. We'll probably put a link in the description of the podcast, so you can see what happened if you haven't seen it already. This was at the Oscars. Um, the Oscar ceremony was being presented, hosted, I should say, by comedian Chris Rock. He made a joke about the wife of the actor Will Smith, who went on to win the Oscar for Best Actor, I believe. Will Smith took offence at the joke and stood up and went to the presenter, up on the stage to the presenter, and hit him on the face. It subsequently looked like it was more of a slap, but some kind of physical offence. Then sat back down and shouted words to the effect of "Do not talk about my wife." And
I would quote it precisely if you want, but people might be listening before the watershed.
well, if I quote it exactly precisely, I have to mark the podcast as being having explicit
Yeah.
content. so,
We'll let you
so
go to YouTube and find
you
it,
can watch it for yourself if you haven't
or
seen it.
any other provider.
Yeah. Now, then what happened was Will Smith subsequently then won the Oscar, so he had to go up and make an acceptance speech, and he made his acceptance for this Oscar, but then clearly was aware that he'd just done something that needed to be acknowledged, and so started talking about this and made what looks like the first attempt at an apology. So what can we say about this first spoken apology?
I haven't looked at that one all the way through, I must admit. Just been so I've been focusing more on the written one and stuff afterwards. But I do know the bits I've seen, most notably, he made the point that it was a joke about his wife's illness, and he was saying that that was unacceptable. And he went on from there to talk about the fact that he was protecting his wife, who had been the butt of a joke by Chris Rock at a previous Oscar performance, it must be said. But then made an analogy between himself doing that and Venus and Serena Williams' father, who he portrayed in the film he won the Oscar for, saying that, Richard Williams devoted his life to protecting his family. So he didn't apologize to Chris Rock at all. He did apologize for his behavior, but tried to turn it into some chivalric act, which in the instance got very mixed responses and caused all sorts of backlash and a formal apology to come later. I don't know, do you remember any other aspects of that apology on stage, Michael?
I think one of the things that stands out is that, well, going back to that list of criteria, what makes an apology is that he didn't name the act that he was apologizing
Right.
for. So there's something, in addition to not naming the person that he'd caused offence to, Chris Rock, in that sense, didn't do that. But I think we'll kind of, if we sort of segue into the formal written apology, there are similarities in that he's apologizing to other people for the offence that he's causing. So not the act itself, but for the offence that it causes to other people around. So the Academy, the audience, the family of the. So the reason he won the Oscar is that he was acting in a biopic about the Williams family, the tennis stars Venus and Serena, and their father. So he apologized to them as part of that for the offence that he was, imparting by association with that.
And it must be admitted, the Williams family, I think the father in particular, Richard, very soon afterwards condemned his behaviour, which is very interesting. Obviously they're very close. This film was a great triumph for them all, but they were quick to condemn him and said violence is never acceptable, which was part of the backlash.
Yeah. yeah,
But also what you're talking about, yeah, exactly. Also picked up on Chris Rock's brother. Oh, he's got several brothers, but his brother Kenny picked up on that performance at the Oscars itself and said, "You never actually apologized to Chris."
yeah,
And
yeah,
and that for him delegitimated it as a speech act, as an apology, because the offence was directly to Chris Rock, not to the Academy, not to the Williams family. They didn't get slapped, and so it was a version of apologizing for bits of the act or effects of the act or the outcry after the act, but not actually for the act itself.
yeah.
I was picked up on that, and then he subsequently, Will Smith, quite soon, I think, published an official written apology,
Yeah, I think
which
that was the next day. I think it
was
was the
quite
next day.
quick, wasn't
Yeah,
it? It was
yeah.
pretty quick.
So we've got a second apology. Should I read that out, Tom, and
Yes,
then we
please,
can
Mike.
sort of go
Yeah,
into
yeah.
it. So we've got this second apology. So it appeared on, I think, on Instagram. We'll put a link into the description. So the formal written apology, which came the following day. Violence in all its forms is poisonous and destructive. My behaviour at last night's Academy Awards was unacceptable and inexcusable. Jokes at my expense are part of the job, but a joke about Jada's medical condition was too much for me to bear, and I reacted emotionally. I would like to publicly apologise to you, Chris. I was out of line and I was wrong. I'm embarrassed and my actions were not indicative of the man I want to be. There is no place for violence in a world of love and kindness. I would also like to apologise to the Academy, the producers of the show, all the attendees, and everyone watching around the world. I would like to apologise to the Williams family and my King Richard family. I deeply regret that my behaviour has stained what has been an otherwise gorgeous journey for all of us. I am a work in progress. So that was his apology there. What's your first reaction?
Well, I think as you pointed out earlier to me, Michael, that he does mention Chris Rock here, which he did in the live
Yeah,
one,
yeah,
and
yeah,
has picked up on his by his brother. But he no longer mentions the offence,
yeah.
and he doesn't apologise. He never mentions the slapping, and he doesn't apologise for. He apologises to Chris, but he apologises for the stain on the Williams family
That's
and
right.
the
Yeah,
Academy, which is
yeah.
so the 2 and 4 are quite different there.
That's right. I mean, that's really interesting. So there are two possible things to apologise for. One is the act itself, actually hitting somebody is the thing that you would want an apology for if you felt that you had been wrongly struck. So
Yeah,
Chris Rock
exactly.
is looking for an apology for the act of being hit. And as you say, in that sentence, the key sentence, I would like to publicly apologise to you, Chris. I was out of line and I was wrong. I'm embarrassed and my actions were not indicative of the man I want to be. Now, there's lots of emotive words in there. The words that you would expect from an apology, I publicly apologise to you, would in most circumstances count as the act of apologising.
Yeah.
But what is missing, according to the pragmatics schema, is that there's no mention of what he's apologising for.
No.
Now, what do we make of that?
If we condense the language, get rid of all the extra words,
Mm,
I would like to apologise to you, Chris, for embarrassing myself, the Williams family, and the Academy.
mm,
And that doesn't make any sense, but
yeah,
it's hidden
yeah,
amongst all this extra words.
yeah,
And I think it's interesting
yeah.
as well because you're talking about the basic felicity conditions, but if we don't take a philosophical view where people are
Mm,
just trying, what logically makes an apology,
yeah,
and we actually look in discourse studies about what happens in apologies, it becomes really, really interesting. And I've just had a wonderful master student who is graduating today, Ha An Tran. So shout out to you, who did a lovely dissertation on Me Too movement apologies and looked at what people did, the different the structure of the different apologies and comparing them, and really interesting. But some of the things that we notice, and this is around whenever people are talking about apologies anyway, as well as those essential conditions, there's often a lot of work done trying to make the offender out to be a person of otherwise unblemished and unimpeachable character. So that's often done. And Will Smith does it a bit himself here. This is out of character.
yeah,
And his mum actually afterwards said, this is so unlike Will, he never does this. So trying to build up this idea that this was a one-off, a mistake, and therefore he's less culpable. We were talking about it earlier that this is the one in when players get red cards in football for extremely dangerous tackles. The manager always comes out the next day and say, "Oh, he's a good lad. He's always very kind in training, and he makes everyone a cup of tea at half time." And they're trying to say, this is out of character. It's an aberration. It's not this person's personality. It was almost not
mm,
them, and therefore they're not to blame. So we see Will Smith doing that a bit, and we see Will Smith's mother trying to build on that to therefore make the apology worth more. But at
So,
the
so, so,
same
so would you?
go
I
on,
mean, so this
go
is this is a kind of an attempt at excusing the behaviour. Does it then count as an apology if you do this? If you say something like, I'm not like that, essentially, it's a way of, is it an acceptable part of an apology, or is it something that is trying to de-emphasize or water down the offence, if you like?
That's such a
Yeah.
fascinating question, isn't it? When you get people talking about apologies, and I think again, if you go to a discourse point of view, and maybe make a distinction here between normativity, what should happen, and performativity, what happens. And I'm much more interested in looking at what do people do,
Yeah.
and what's the reaction to that, rather than yes, this fulfilled the criteria for an apology. So looking at the reactions to it, and
Right.
we
Yeah.
really get into this where you'll have people having heated arguments whether this was an apology because, oh, look, he said, I'm sorry, can't we move on?
Mm.
And then someone will say, yeah, but, and there will be people picking up on all these instances of why it didn't satisfy them as an apology. And I think that's a much more interesting area to go than
Yeah.
whether it meets
Okay. Yeah.
philosophical criteria. It's,
Yeah.
does the public accept it? Does the victim accept it as an apology? And then it becomes much more fascinating area to look at.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've already said that, Chris Rock's brother publicly said this doesn't count as an apology. He said that about the first live apology, but I don't know if we've seen anything about this second one.
Yeah, he
Uh,
did. What he did was he said he didn't apologize to Chris on stage.
mm,
And then he said after the formal one, once he'd been advised by his publicist.
ah,
So what is
ah,
he's doing there? He's
uh,
totally undermining the sincerity condition. And this is saying, he sat down with his lawyer and his publicist, drafted this. They've looked at the philosophical stuff and all the stuff in the, tweets about what goes down well with the public. That's what they're interested in. And they know if you throw in all this blarney about being a good guy and all this stuff, it helps. It's never totally satisfactory, but so it's interesting. You've got Will Smith's mother aware that if you build up the person's good character, it will make the apology stronger. And then you've got on the other side, Kenny Rock undermining the sincerity condition to make it not an apology. So people are very savvy about
yeah,
what makes a speech act
yeah,
good or
yeah,
not.
yeah, yeah. And this is one of the things I do like about speech act theory. It tries to account for the things that we very often can do ourselves.
Yeah.
It's not, you don't have to be a specialist to sort of understand the kind of intricacies of some of this. It's just a way of formalizing what we're talking about. So we've got this undermining the sincerity, and undermining the sincerity because of the time that's passed, and by pointing out that the additional words that are around that phrase, I apologize to you, Chris, are trying to mitigate the act of actually hitting the guy on stage
Yeah.
by doing the exact same things as you do. But there's another way that he does that, which is not just saying that I'm a good guy. I'm not, that this isn't the man that I want to be.
Exactly.
There's
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
place for violence. So all of those things. So there's the character, building up the character. But the other thing is explaining and giving the rationale for why he did that. And that's the part where he says, jokes at my expense are part of the job. Part of what he's doing there is actually pointing out that he's actually a very, very well-known figure. And I expect that. I'm a target for these kinds of jokes. And I'm not, but that's not what's caused offence. What's caused offence is a joke about Jada's medical condition was too much for me to be. So at the same time, it's kind of saying, well, this is why I did it, because you offended me by making a joke about my wife, which is not acceptable, which is what he's trying to do there. But at the same time, he's almost letting or giving the impression that he's not responsible. He didn't do this by an act of volition. He didn't choose to do this. He was overwhelmed. It was too much for me to bear, and I reacted emotionally. He's not. So interesting what he's doing there. He's not saying I considered your joke, thought about it, and decided that the correct response would be to stand up and hit you because this is not an acceptable thing. He's not saying that at all. He's saying, I almost
That's
this was beyond my control. You
yeah.
said something that caused a reaction in me, not an action, a reaction, which was the
And I think
response.
that brings us back when we talked about the racism in the coverage of Ukraine and the fact that it was based on the fact of trying to create more sympathy, but it did it from a very
Mm.
white perspective, this idea of making yourself seem more like your audience.
Mm.
You're no longer this Hollywood star. You acted just like you would. If someone insulted your
Yeah.
wife, would you do this? And it's sort of getting sympathy by making yourself closer to the other people. It actually, when we're talking about going back to football, but this tangled web of apologies and everything that comes out afterwards and the debate about it, it made me think about Eric Cantona when
Oh, yeah.
he did his kung fu kick, which I remember very, very well. And Cantona, being the man he is, just didn't apologize. He knew better to get himself in this mire. And I remember a very funny advert he did, and he started off saying, "I must admit, I made a terrible mistake this season. I missed a penalty in such and such a
Yes.
game,"
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and played on this. Basically said, "I'm not going to apologize for this. I did this kung fu kick and I
Mm.
meant it.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
is the real me."
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
wasn't
Yeah.
just passive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
a bit of an aside, but it
No.
made me think
I mean,
sometimes it's best to stay out of this whole
yeah,
apology thing.
yeah, yeah. Oh, so what he did, I mean, because some people won't remember that. So there was a football match, Manchester United. I can't remember who they were playing, but somebody from the,
Surprise.
yeah, so somebody from the crowd was shouting something about some abuse at direct. Probably, I think it was at Eric Cantona, one of
Yeah.
the star players at that time, and he ran and did a flying kick, which he became known as the kung fu kick, and kicked this member of the crowd. Yeah. So yeah,
No, it's a very famous event in the time. And
yeah,
he was such a controversial and charismatic personality as well. It really made great headlines. And the funny thing was, he did not apologize. He made that joke quite a bit later. But there was still an awful lot of press coverage spent either blaming him or making apologies on his
on the
behalf on the
ourself. Yeah.
basis of stuff like
Mm,
this. So other
yeah.
people were creating the sincerity conditions for him,
Yeah.
even though he never performed the act.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you get that. And the other one I was thinking of, which is very famous, and without getting into the pros and cons of the point, was Jeremy Corbyn and the anti-Semitism row, which obviously politicians have realised this was a very, very good way to skewer Corbyn, whether for right or wrong. And I remember the headline, people were asking him to apologise for this, and he refused. And this became a headline in itself, because one of the things about, to bring us on to another linguistic idea, I'm also connected with the felicity
Yeah.
conditions, by apologizing, you are automatically saying you did it
Yeah.
and that it was wrong, because you don't need to apologize for something that wasn't wrong. And media use this quite often to put celebrities and politicians of all stripes in a difficult position and to get a headline for the television program, to be honest, as much as anything else. Because if you make the apology, you've admitted to doing the offence.
Yeah.
And if you don't make the apology, then the presenter asks you 4 or 5 times, and you get exactly the headline that Corbyn got the next day was, "Corbyn refuses 4 times to apologise."
Yeah.
And I said, what's the difference between refusing once, refusing twice? What's the difference? Because if you actually don't think you did any wrong, whether you did wrong or not, if you don't think you did wrong,
Mm.
you're not going to apologise. So you can ask for as many times as you like. And I've seen, and I do feel sympathy with politicians on all sides when this happens, because there's no way out of that unless you just very blithely say, as some other politicians might, without any sincerity at all, "Yes, I apologise," because they know that's what they're supposed to do. Whereas Corbyn, because of his particular way of seeing the world and his very straight, hard line way of seeing the world, wasn't going to take that pragmatic way out, and he just
Mm.
dug himself a hole, irrespective of whether what he did was right or wrong before that. I'm not interested in that at the moment. But the fact that he had a sort of personality that was very unbending, and he could not bring himself to apologize for something when he didn't think he'd done anything wrong,
Yeah.
which is really interesting as well. And he ended up, that was one level of sincerity that's actually quite opposite to the sincerity condition that's needed for an apology, and
Yeah.
caused all sorts of problems.
Yeah. 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 No, that's a really interesting example of that. The other thing that politicians occasionally do is then apologize, not for the thing that is caused, that not for the act itself, but for the offence that was subsequently caused. Now, this is an interesting one because people call these, not real apologies.
Yeah.
People pick up on these. So the kind of thing would be, yeah, X thing happened yesterday, and I apologize for any offence that was caused. So you're apologizing for the reaction in other people, not for the thing that you
Yeah.
did. Now, this is slightly controversial, isn't it? Because, I mean, I've seen some discourse analysis work on this, which kind of suggests that if there's an effect of what you've done, you can regret the effect that it had, that it's valid to then apologize for that effect rather than the act. I'm not so sure. What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, personally, I think, yeah, I think if you're in this position where you feel you behaved correctly and it somehow caused offence, you are again in this cleft stick, because
Mm,
if you apologize for the original act, you're saying you did wrong, and it's, you can cause problems acting in goodwill. And I actually think, from a moral point of view, it's perfectly acceptable to do that. But again, it causes all sorts of problems if you do that. And it might always just be better to zip up and not say anything that, because whenever this happens, we seem to see a big reaction. I mean, what do you think? I mean, is it avoiding an apology? Is it a good move, or do you think it's quite legitimate to say, I'm
mm.
sorry for the offence, but I still stand by my original act?
Yeah, yeah. I think in the abstract, I think that sounds fair enough. Yeah, it does. I think possibly when you get into the details of a specific apology in a specific
Yes.
situation, that's where it gets a bit more messy, doesn't it? I mean, I think, and going back to the Will Smith apology here, he regrets his behaviour. Sorry, the last line. I did regret that my behaviour has stained what has been an otherwise gorgeous journey for all of us. So that's the same type of thing, isn't it? I'm not
Yeah.
apologising for hitting um, Chris Rock. I'm apologising for the effect that it's had on this unnamed group of people. I guess he means the Williams family, the Academy, and all of the other people he's just listed. So it's the effect. If nobody had been bothered about it, there'd be nothing to apologise for him,
Yeah,
according to what is.
that's the logic of what he's saying, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So so what? So yeah, thinking about this issue, should you apologise for the unintended consequences of your actions? Well, yeah, probably you should. However, in this case, because he hasn't named the offence that
Exactly.
he's
Yeah,
originally done, then it makes it sound a little bit hollow, doesn't it? Because he hasn't said, I
definitely.
apologise to you, Chris, for hitting you in the face, which when you say those words, it seems so unlikely. We're so used to people not fulfilling that condition of naming the offence for which they are
Yeah.
then apologising. So it sounds strange to think of this Hollywood actor saying something like, I apologise for hitting you in the face, Chris. But
But I
that's
think,
because it's such an unusual act in the first place, isn't it?
and that's why we can never look at discourse divorced from context and what
Yeah.
happened, can, because
Yeah.
it makes a difference. So that's exactly it. Because he doesn't justify hitting Chris Rock in the face. And as you say, it would be really, you deserved this, Chris, and I was acting well. However, I'm really sorry if it upset other people. And he couldn't say that. It'd be hard. But you do get people who say,
Yeah.
look, I was acting in all goodwill. So to move on from Corbyn, for example, in COVID, you do get scientists and politicians saying, we thought those were the right decisions at the time, given the information we have had at the
Mm.
time. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case, and it caused lots of problems. And to me, first of all, that's perfectly valid. But they've actually said it, gone out of their way to say the original act was in good intent, and we thought at the time it was the right act. Therefore, we're only apologising for the side effects. So that's much more sensible than what Will Smith's
Mm.
doing, because it would be, as you say, was inconceivable of him to say, what I did at the time was, well, he's already done that at the Oscars, so maybe he knows that's in the background, and that's
Mm.
probably going to get
Mm.
more coverage than his actual apology. So maybe he's been very careful. He's done that bit of saying, yeah, you would have hit him too. But in the apology, he's not. He can't say in the official written apology, I stand by my actions. However, I'm really sorry. I was
Yeah.
acting on the best information I had at the time, which of course has also been undermined. Talking about other people undermining it, as happens now in this multimedia age, footage has arisen of Will Smith on a chat show making a joke about someone with alopecia. So,
Mm.
there we
Yeah.
go. Where's your
Yeah.
sincerity conditions now?
Yeah.
And of course, he could then say, of course, I only came to be fully aware of the seriousness of the condition because of my wife's condition, etc. But it's all this work, to undermine stuff and to strengthen people's apologies once they've been done. And it's fascinating.
Yeah. No, that really is. And this has been a really enjoyable discussion. The issue at hand, you're particularly interested in these Hollywood stars, but the issue that it brings up is a really key one for discourse analysis, isn't it? This
Absolutely.
the public apology, and as we've said, it's a very prominent feature of political public discourse. It happens in every day. interactions. It's a really important function of language, isn't it? And how we go about negotiating these speech acts, the acts that we engage with in every day. And when you get a complex situation, trying to appease people, but without admitting things that you don't want to admit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and all sorts of different bits of linguistic theory in there. Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's as you say, it's become much more prominent. Governments. I mean, how can a government apologize? A government's not a person. Are supposed to apologize for all sorts of things now, and it's a very interesting one, isn't it? I mean, we just saw it, for example, with one of the royals apologizing for slavery.
Yeah.
And that draws very mixed reactions as well. Saying, "Oh, words are cheap," will be one response. But then on the other hand, a lot of people like this symbolic recognition, at least that it was an offence, and that's the part of it.
Yeah.
At least by apologizing, you are recognizing that it was an offence, even if you were not directly responsible for it. It was hundreds of years ago. Even if you're not doing enough to rectify it now, at least you're marking it down as an offence. Whereas other people are focusing on the other bit and saying, well, actually, an apology needs reparation, and that's actually one of the things that we don't see a promise of reparation. Though when you start looking at, it's interesting to talk about Will Smith saying, that's not the man I want to be. One of the things my student Anne found in all the apologies for Me Too was a very recurrent feature in all these was the actor or the director being on a trajectory of improvement, and that they were going to learn from this and become better people. And that seemed to be one of the elements that people were starting to put in these apologies. It was a very bad mistake. It's not the person I want to be. I'm learning from this. I will be a better person in future, which you can see the logic of. But if you're the victim, you're thinking, hey, man, this isn't all about you.
Yeah, that's what it does. It
and your life journey.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's true. It centers the apology, if you like. It centers the person who's making the apology or rather than the victim. Yeah. Whereas a very straightforward, I apologize to you for doing this is much more simple. Yeah. No, that's really interesting.
No, exactly.
Really interesting.
One of the ones, just very quickly, of the ones that my student looked at, the very first one is Ben Affleck, who just says, I acted inappropriately towards Ms. Burton and I sincerely apologize. End of. I quite like that, but I don't know what other people think. Then you get the others that are paragraphs and reams of people's life stories and the problems they had and how they're going to be better people. And it's just really interesting to see the different strategies that people used towards this. And I quite like Ben Affleck's, I was wrong, I'm sorry. That I can see why people don't like it, but for me, it does capture something about, hopefully he's sincere. That's all that needs to be said in a way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is that I behaved inappropriately. Is that a euphemism rather than naming the act?
That's a good point. Yeah.
But on the other parts of it, it's straightforward. Doesn't bring in the life story and de-emphasize it in that way. No, it's fascinating. The MA thesis that you're talking about sounds really fascinating. Should we put a link to that in the?
I'll ask Kyan if we can do that. Yeah, that'd be great.
If we can, we'll do that, and if it's available on Glasgow's platform,
I'll make sure I move heaven and earth to make that possible.
Yep, great.
And I apologise in advance if I'm not able to do that.
Yes.
So what is an apology in advance?
Can you apologise for things that have not happened? Not yet happened. Yeah. Okay. Shall we wrap up on that?
Yeah. Very enjoyable.
That's great.
Talk today, Michael. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Me too. So we'll see you all.
In our mind's eye.
In our mind's eye. Next time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye now.